From having 0 spores to altering the time period. Here's every little detail from the Last of Us game that's left out of the HBO series. Starting off with how the show dealt with the spread of infection. So in the video game, the infection's carried by spores. Spores are tiny packets of viruses that float through the air in places where there are lots of infected people and fungi. This happens a lot in the game. So Joel has to wear a gas mask to get through these tight, deadly places. This makes for some very terrifying moments for the player in the game. But in the show, the spores have been replaced by a tendril-like substance that's worked its way into the cities. This makes the infection like a hive mind. So if you make a mistake, the Horde will know you're there. This makes the threat more immediate and keeps the characters on their toes. But The Last of Us is an action-adventure game, so it needs to have a lot of action scenes to keep players interested for, let's say, 14+ hours. And even though the game has a lot of quiet moments that help you get to know the characters and the world, they're separated by dozens of gunfights between raiders and the infected. Plus, the show has a lot less action than it used to. And instead, it focuses more on getting to know its characters. Neil Druckmann, the creator of both, chose to only include the most disturbing parts of the game's violence in the show to make them more shocking.
Sorry about your daughter, Joel.
You have no idea what loss is.
But I have lost people too.
But here's the thing. The game never tries to hide the fact that Joel can do bad things. In fact, one of the game's first scenes shows just that. After Robert cheats on them in a deal, Joel and Tess go after him and torture him until he tells them where their stolen things are. Tess doesn't let him go. Instead, she kills him in cold blood. But so far, the show has implied that Joel has done bad things in the past by having Ellie ask him about it. However, the fans haven't seen it for themselves yet. Even the scene with Robert was changed so that he was killed off by the Fireflies off-screen, and that Joel and Tess only killed other people to stay alive. And that's kinda concerning. Because during the first quarter of the game, Fedra is always a threat to Joel, Ellie, and Tess. After getting out of the quarantine zone and running into the guard who tells them that Ellie's infected, the group is chased by Fedra soldiers. And Tess, who has been bitten, stays behind to fight them off, which kills her. Now, so far, Fedra hasn't been in the show as much, and the corrupt armed force has only been seen once, in the first episode, when they were security personnel in the quarantine zone. But in order to protect the rest of the group, Joel has to beat up a guard who sees them leaving. And this is the first time you see how brutal he really is. Plus, in one part of the game, Joel and Ellie have to find their way through Bill's bomb-filled town while Joel looks for an old friend. And keep in mind, Bill's still alive in this version. So when the two reach him, he assists them in locating a car engine throughout an action set piece in a school. And that's where many infected are thrown at the player. But Episode 3 is a big change from the original story, which now everyone knows. Instead of fixating on zombie action, the show tells the love story of Bill, played by Nick Offerman, who's a prepper for the end of the world. And Frank, played by Murray Bartlett, is a wandering survivor in a beautiful sequence from the beginning to the end. But Bill is still alive in the game's timeline, so Joel and Ellie run into him when they get to his town. Even though he's an old friend of Joel's, he still hasn't met Ellie. So as Bill handcuffs her to a wall, he and Ellie are at odds with each other.
Hey, what are you... Joel?
Bill!
What are you doing?
Bill!
Let me go.
Turn around and get on your knees.
Just calm down a second.
Turn around and get on your knees. Don't test me.
And some of the funniest parts of the game come from how these two strong characters play off each other. But the show changes the story so that Bill's already dead when Joel and Ellie come to visit. In flashbacks, you see him talking with Joel, but he never gets to meet Ellie. Even though Bill's story made for great TV, it's too bad that Offerman and Ramsey didn't get to go at each other. And I was quite excited about that. But this arc is way more emotional, and I like it this way. And even though The Last of Us has an adult story and is one of the best examples of how video games can be art, it's still a game at heart. And I say this because one of its most game-like features is Listen Mode, which lets Joel see white silhouettes of enemies hiding behind walls. And players who use stealth to their advantage will find it very useful. Now, of course, the Listen Mode was never going to be a part of the show. But it's funny to think of Joel telling Ellie to wait while he crouches down and uses his secret superpower to find enemies nearby. And you'll find this hilarious after knowing, but the amount of crouching in the show has been cut down. That's because the showrunner, Craig Mazin, says that a 50-year-old person in real life can't crouch as much as they do in the game, which is true, but again, funny. But other than the crouching, in The Last of Us, enemies come at the player in the way that most video games do. Likewise, Joel and Ellie are attacked by both people and the infected, but the bloater is one of their less common foes. And since these dangerous monsters have been exposed to cordyceps for a long time, they've grown fungi all over their bodies that protect them. But so far, the show has only given Joel and Ellie the usual runners and clickers when it comes to the infected. Bloaters are first seen in the game during the scene in Bill's town, so this reveal was left out of the show. And I really hope that this scary creature will be shown on the show before the season's over. Also, both versions of The Last of Us start in Texas and Boston, but in episode 4, Joel and Ellie go to Kansas City, where bandits wait for them. And when they're forced to leave their car, they find a place to hide while Kathleen looks for them. She's the one who's in charge of the city's revolutionary movement. And even though these things happen in a similar way to what happens in the game, Joel and Ellie end up in Pittsburgh instead. The change in location doesn't mean anything. But Mazin and Druckmann say it was just easier to make Kansas City look like Pittsburgh, and that Pittsburgh wasn't important enough to keep. And that might not matter for the person who's just watching the show. But for someone who has played both parts of the game, it matters a lot. Because see, the video game came out in 2013, and its story starts the same year. After Sarah's death, the series jumps 20 years down the road to 2033, and picks up with Joel and Sarah in the present. And it's pretty unusual to play a game set in the future that doesn't have any science fiction elements. But instead, the show sets its prologue in 2003. Which means that when it does the same time jump, it takes place in 2023. Mazin explained why he made this change by saying he thinks it's hard for people to connect with stories set in the far future. But it's easier to do so when the story's set in the present. That's all for details left out of The Last of Us. See you in the next one.